have thought long and hard about and studied and come to this conclusion based on that kind of information? Or is it you picked it up from watching movies and TV, from hearing your friends talk, from reading memes passed around on Facebook? Like, where is your opinion coming from? And as we've seen from previous articles and surveys and such like things over the years, most people who are against various aspects of immigration are or feel that way. Sorry, my light went out there for a second. Because I guess ignorance, basically. I mean, they lack an understanding of the question. So their impression is based on incomplete information or erroneous information that they picked up from some dubious source somewhere. So, as one article stated that I read a while back, when you educate people about immigration, their opinion about it becomes more favorable, pretty much across the board. So, how can I boil all of this down? I guess what I'm saying is that even though it's a complex question, and there are lots of reasons why people feel the way that they do, overall, if you subtract people who are poorly informed and people whose opinions are based on some kind of antipathy towards those who are different in some way, there aren't a lot of people left. It's not a very big number who oppose immigration based on any sort of realistic and rational foundation. Yeah, there aren't a lot of people who are just like, I've studied the financial benefits and the social benefits and all those things, and my conclusion is that less immigration is preferable. It's really a pretty small number. So what has happened is you take that group, whoever that group is, who sincerely believes this based on, plausible scenarios and rational thinking. Whether I agree with it or not, it's at least rational. Like they've looked at whatever their metrics are that they're using and said, based on these, I think immigration is not a good idea. And then you add people who are ignorant of the question and easily swayed. That becomes a much larger number. And then people who are prejudiced in some way for some reason. Religion, culture, ethnicity. Who knows? And then that's where you get a number that's large enough that you have a kind of one of the two major political parties in this country has decided that its best course of action is to be anti-immigrant. It didn't used to be that way, but now they've kind of fixated on that and said, well, there's enough of them, and they're hardcore and they're really into it, so we're going to cater to them. And by doing that, by catering to them, they're also feeding that as well because they want to keep it alive. So, that's where you had like the whole Trump administration constantly pushing misinformation about immigrants because they were trying to keep that antipathy burning hot so that people would continue to support an otherwise really awful bunch of folks. So that's a whole other thing. I'm glad that thing is over. But so that's my conclusion based on this whole thing and on everything that I've read and believed since then. I'm not saying that everybody that's pro-immigration feels that way for quote right reasons. I'm sure there are people that are misinformed and people who are prejudiced and people who have all sorts of weird opinions involved in that side too. I am just saying that my conclusion is that ultimately there's more reason to be pro-immigration than anti-immigration, obviously, since that's the work that I do and that's the slant of this show. That is the bias, which we admit cheerfully on this in this show. But I do think it's easier for people to become pro-immigration if they have spent any time studying the issue dispassionately. And by study, I don't mean do your own research in that way that anti-vaxxers and flat earthers and all those people like go seek out the information that says this and then you will have done your research. I don't mean it like that, but I mean if they've actually studied the issue and read reports and thought about it, I think the tendency is to be more pro-immigration than not. I think if you are a person who, they talked a lot in this thing about being a global citizen versus a national citizen, in your identity, your sense of self. And I think if you think that just sounds weird. If you think of the world as a fairly small thing in a very large universe, and the human race is a pretty tiny group of relatively insignificant beings in the vast cosmos, then you will realize that we're all kind of in it together. Like what we do over here affects them over there, regardless of how much we might say, nope, it's not your issue. This is our little piece of land. I mean, if I decide to play my drums, for example, I'm a drummer, set up on the front porch and play my drums, that's not just me. It's everybody within like a block or more is going to have to share that experience with me. So it's not like I can say, hey, I'm on my property. I'm a citizen of Tomville, the Tom Nation. And, that's what I do. I play my drums every morning at 4 a.m. Well, it doesn't fly. It spreads. If I burn my trash, like, hey, I'm going to take all my trash outside and burn it every day, other people are going to be breathing that smoke. There are all sorts of things that I do or I could do that would have a huge effect on everybody around me. So it's not like you can just say, well, I don't care. I'm an American and that's that, and we'll do what we want here, and the rest of the world, you just deal with it, because we are all connected in one way or another. No two ways about it. You cannot argue or rationalize your way out of the fact that we are all connected and that what one does, everybody feels the effect of. It may seem like a very small effect. I mean, it's, you can feel pretty small and helpless in the grand scheme of things when you're trying to change the world for a better place, for example. You feel pretty puny and unimportant. But it does have an effect. This show by itself, I don't think very many people watch it. But some do. And of the ones that do, some percentage, I'm not even going to guess how large that percentage is, some percentage are going to be affected by what I'm saying. They're going to hear it and go, that makes sense to me, or I didn't know that, or That's an interesting point. Somebody is going to be affected by it. That's why I do it. It's not to be popular, because if I wanted to be popular, I'd have a show about something else and I'd present it in a different way. I would, clean myself up a little bit, get a nice background, say, hey, uh, do better sound, better video, better graphics, better whatever. But it's pretty basic stuff that I'm doing here. I just turn on the camera, start talking, read a few news stories, and pontificate every now and then. Sometimes they make sense. Sometimes I talk myself in a circle and I have no idea what I'm talking about. But that's just, hey, there's another technical glitch right there. Um, that's just the way it is. It's it's like this because the main point of the show is to share information. It's to get these ideas and this info out there into the world somewhere, some little bit, and it'll trickle on down the stream. You'll listen to this and you go, I didn't know that. And then the next time somebody's talking about immigration, you'll go, hey, here's something that you may not know. And you'll say that to them. And they'll say that to somebody else. And on and on and on. So there is an effect. It does have an effect. And it may be a very small effect, but it is an effect. And that's why it's worth doing. And so, anyway, I'm just using myself and my little tiny public television show, radio show, as an example of how even something as small and relatively unimpressive as this can have an effect and will touch people and will make a difference. And then you expand that to the size of a whole country, particularly one as huge as the United States. And the stuff we do here affects everybody around the world to some extent, either directly because we're trying to. We've been known to mess with other governments and, get involved with things, start wars, and do all sorts of nefarious things in different places, and good things too. Give away money and provide assistance and whatever. So there's a little bit of both. We have good and bad effects on the world, but we have an effect on the world. So it's all a very, very long way around saying that I don't think that you can take that America first kind of philosophy and really be intellectually honest. It's just not tenable to say we're going to promote ourselves and take care of ourselves, and the rest of the world, you're on your own, because they're not. I mean, I suppose if we could leave them alone in some way, like we could consume our own greenhouse gases and breathe our own pollution and deal with our own plastic waste and somehow replenish all of the natural resources that we're using up here that other people could be using, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line. If we could somehow do that, then yeah, it might be something that you could say. But because we don't, and we're not, and we can't, then so on and so forth. Okay. I'm rambled on too long about that. But I just think it's really important for all of us to be honest with ourselves and each other when we consider our place in the world. And we are global citizens, whether we like it or not, whether we want to be or not. And simply pretending that we're not, or turning our back on everybody else and saying we're going to worry about ourselves first and foremost, is you're lying to yourself if you think that you can do that and not have it be something akin to walking through a group of people on the ground who are starving and saying, well, that's your problem, it's not mine, I'm just not going to do anything about it. It doesn't work that way. The world doesn't work that way. Anyway, enough about that stuff. I have a little bit of time left. I'm going to read this article. Schumer readies Plan B to push immigration changes unilaterally. Well, this is from a while back, and it still hasn't happened yet, as far as I know. But we'll just share it anyway. So, Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York and the majority leader, is quietly considering trying to use a fast-track budget maneuver to legalize millions of undocumented immigrants should bipartisan talks on providing a pathway to citizenship fall apart. Mr. Schumer has privately told members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus in recent weeks that he is actively exploring whether it would be possible to attach a broad revision of immigration law to President Biden's infrastructure plan and pass it through a process known as budget reconciliation, according to two people briefed on his comments. The move would allow the measure to pass the evenly divided Senate with a simple majority of 51 votes, shielding them from a filibuster and the 60-vote threshold for moving past one, which would otherwise require at least 10 Republican votes. The strategy is part of a backup plan Mr. Schumer has lined up in the event that talks among 15 senators in both parties failed to yield a compromise. As the negotiations drag on with little agreement in sight, proponents are growing increasingly worried that Democrats may squander a rare opportunity to legalize broad swaths of the undocumented population while their party controls both chambers of Congress and the White House. Democrats must act, says Sergio Gonzalez, the director of the Immigration Hub, which pushes for a pro-immigrant agenda in Congress. Now is the time. This year is the time. We must have citizenship this year. Mr. Biden's immigration plan would provide a pathway to citizenship for an estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants and increase diversity visa and border security funding. But, conceding the long odds of achieving such extensive changes, lawmakers are focusing on cobbling together a package of smaller bills that would legalize about 8 million or fewer undocumented immigrants. They include House-passed legislation to grant legal status to people brought to the United States as children, known as Dreamers, immigrants who were granted temporary protected status for humanitarian reasons, and close to 1 million farm workers. Speaker Nancy Pelosi last month endorsed the idea of using reconciliation to push through an immigration measure, citing the budget impacts of immigration in our country. Senator Patty Murray of Washington, the number 3 Democrat, came out in favor of the approach last week. Still, the strategy carries risks and is far from guaranteed to succeed. Republicans involved in the talks warn that before Congress can act to address undocumented immigrants, it must address the large influx of migrants across the southwestern border. In March, border agents encountered nearly 19,000 children at the border, the largest number recorded in a single month, most of them fleeing poverty and violence in Central America, though the numbers are dropping. Before we can do anything meaningful on immigration, we're going to have to deal with the current crisis at the border, said Senator John Cornyn, Republican of Texas, who has been involved in the bipartisan talks. I don't think the public is going to tolerate us ignoring this crisis, and it's just going to get worse unless we deal with it. As for moving Mr. Biden's immigration agenda through reconciliation, he said, I think they're dreaming. I don't think the parliamentarian will allow that. That's not really the purpose of reconciliation. To pull it off, Democrats would have to grapple with strict budget rules that limit what can be done under reconciliation. They require that any policy change included must have a budgetary impact that is more than merely incidental. Other measures favored by liberal activists, such as a federal minimum wage increase to $15 per hour, have been nixed from a reconciliation package by the Senate parliamentarian, the ultimate arbiter of the rules, for failing to meet that bar. The parliamentarian, Elizabeth McDonough, recently said that the reconciliation process could be used at least once more during this fiscal year. That ruling was widely seen as paving the way for Democrats to advance Mr. Biden's infrastructure bill using the fast-track process. It also set progressive activists to thinking about what else they could push through, including measures to address climate change, expand Medicare, and revamp the immigration system. A team of immigration activists and researchers, as well as congressional aides, is exploring the question, digging into the best way to present their case to Ms. McDonough, who declined to comment for this article. Let's see. I'm losing my place. They have found past precedents, including one from 2005, in which changes to immigration policy were allowed as part of a budget reconciliation package, and they are tallying up the budgetary effects of the immigration proposals, which total in the tens of billions of dollars. Researchers have dredged up supporting quotes from Republicans from 2005, when they won sign-off for including a measure to recapture unused visas for high-skilled workers in a reconciliation package. Mr. Cornyn praised the move at the time as a way to keep jobs here in America, rather than export them to places like India and China. The pro-immigration group, FWD.us, hired Kevin Kayes, a former assistant Senate parliamentarian, to help own the procedural argument in favor of allowing the maneuver this year. Those provisions are the precedent for us, said Carrie Talbot, the deputy director of the Immigration Hub. A lot of things we're trying to do now relate to what was approved in 2005. Ms. Talbot says she believes the total budget impact of the immigration bills under consideration is high enough to meet the reconciliation standard. We're definitely in the tens of billions. We think we passed that test, she said. The estimated cost of the House-passed legalization measures is about $40 billion over 10 years. Immigration advocates are also pushing for an expedited pathway to citizenship for the more than 5 million unauthorized immigrants who are essential workers, which is likely to carry an even higher budget impact on health care benefits, Medicaid spending, and tax credits. 22 Democrats, including 4 senators, recently wrote a letter to Mr. Biden urging him to include an immigration overhaul in his infrastructure package. Many are worried that they will lose control of Congress in the 2022 midterm elections and fearful that the Supreme Court will strike down former President Barack Obama's protection for Dreamers. We ought to take this opportunity, this term, to finally do what the American people want us to do, which is pass immigration reform, Representative Joaquin Castro, Democrat of Texas, and one of the letter's authors, said in an interview. I don't think the Republicans should be able to run the clock out on this term before we pass meaningful immigration reform through the Senate. Yet, not all Democrats are likely to support a unilateral approach. Senator Kyrsten Sinema, Democrat of Arizona, is co-sponsoring legislation with Mr. Cornyn to respond to the increase in migrants at the southern border by funding 4 regional processing centers in high-traffic Border Patrol sectors and improving the administration's capacity to deal with such influxes. For now, Senator Richard J. Durbin, the number 2 Democrat who has for years pushed for a path to citizenship for the Dreamers, said that he was focused on passing a bipartisan immigration bill and that Mr. Schumer had encouraged him to work to reach a deal with Republicans. We agree on a bipartisan basis. We've got to reform the system, Mr. Durbin said. Senator Thom Tillis, Republican of North Carolina, another of the 15 senators involved in the immigration talks, said he believed that trying to use the reconciliation process for immigration reform would be a disaster. But Mr. Tillis said he thought a bipartisan deal that couples a path to citizenship for the Dreamers with a greater investment in border security was still possible and perhaps getting closer. The crisis at the border is undisputable. Even the president admits that now. So if we can work on that and then work on some of the path options that I've supported in the past, I'm guardedly optimistic, he said. It annoys me to read quotes from some of these guys. They're so full of it. Anyway, Well, I've run out of time, and my voice is checking out on me here. But I really appreciate, you know, all the time that you've stuck with me, that you've joined me for the show, and you spent time wading your way through some of this stuff along with me, because I do think this is really important to the country as a whole. I know a lot of people say the United States is a nation of immigrants. Well, sort of. I mean, it's kind of a weird statement in a number of ways, and it's problematic, but it is at least true-ish to the extent that most people here who are not actually Native American um, came here as immigrants. I mean, or they're descended from immigrants or something like that. So, in that sense, and because of the recent founding of this as a country called the United States, that makes the notion of a nation of immigrants more realistic. Because I mean, people wander to and fro all around the world and always have. So, you know, in that sense, all nations are or have been at some point nations of immigrants. It's just that the longer it was since people ended up settling there, and the greater the number of people who had been there for generations versus newcomers, the less you could use that kind of statement about them, you know, basically. Like Japan, for example, is not a nation of immigrants. It's a nation of Japanese, even though over time Koreans and Chinese and you know, other people have come there. Most Japanese people are descended from other Japanese people going way, way back. And so the majority of people in that country are Japanese. And therefore, you would not call that a nation of immigrants, regardless of the fact that the blood, if I can use that term, of immigrants runs through the people of Japan to some extent. But the United States is a more recently established country, nation, and the majority of the people here presently are or have at some point in their history come from somewhere else. And so, leaving aside the native nations that have always been here or have been here for long enough that we can call them, say they've always been here, yeah, this is kind of a nation of immigrants in that respect. And so the idea that we're just suddenly going to shut the door and say, no, everybody from here on out is a foreigner, and from here on back is a true American, is just nonsense. That's just ridiculous and self-serving and ludicrous. So, anyway, I have run out of time. I've got to go, but thank you for joining us, and I hope we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.